Oh, shit.
Great. Shall we start?
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Perfect. All right. Fantastic. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming to today's panel. What was Occupy 10 years later? Just to give some background with respect to the Platypus Affiliated Society, since that was asked up front. The Platypus Affiliated Society, which was established in December 2006, organizes reading groups, public fora, research and journalism focused on problems and tasks inherited from the old 1920s, 30s, new 1960s, 70s, and post-political 1980s, 90s left for the possibilities of emancipatory politics today. Today's panel on Occupy, which is being hosted by the Platypus Affiliated Society, I'm going to read the panel prompt right now before introducing our speakers, our panelists for today. The 10-year anniversary of the Occupy movement has prompted a number of retrospective assessments. These have ranged from focusing on the strategic lessons learned from Occupy to reflections about the need to rediscover the spirit of Occupy that some may feel have been lost. In light of this, we asked the panelists the following. What was the meaning of Occupy, and how does it make sense in light of the recent and distant historical experience on the left? How did the experience of Occupy change how we think about the legacy of the left? How have the lessons learned or not learned from Occupy affected the future horizons of leftist politics? So before I introduce the panelists, I just want to give the kind of format for today. Panelists will have 12 minutes maximum at the beginning for their opening remarks. I will come on screen and give a kind of 1-minute remark. I'll kind of do something like that with my finger at the 11-minute remark, at which time you should move towards the final paragraph or two of your presentation. After the panelists have given their opening remarks, we will have a round of responses between the panelists that should be sort of max 3 minutes. This is for each panelist. This is sort of your first impressions on the opening remarks. And then finally, and this is sort of what we're aiming for, is to have an hour of Q&A between the audience and the panelists. Just 2 things to mention. The panelists will see all the audience questions that are written before the audience can. So please do not respond until I have read the question so that the audience knows what question you're responding to, because sometimes you'll respond to it and people won't know exactly. And 2, just to be somewhat conscious of sort of the time. I don't want to step on anybody's toes, but if you kind of start to repeat yourself, I might sort of ask if you can just move along, just so we can get more questions in the spirit of the democratic pluralism of Occupy, of getting as many people to speak as possible. So to introduce our panelists for today, and I'm going to introduce them in the order that they're going to speak. Arun Gupta founded the Occupied Wall Street Journal and covered the Occupy movement across the country, visiting 41 occupations in 26 states over the course of a year. His work has appeared in The Intercept, The Guardian, The Raw Story, The Daily Beast, and The Washington Post. He is a Lannan Writing Fellow, a French-trained chef, and author of the forthcoming Bacon as a Weapon of Mass Destruction, a junk food loving chef's inquiry into taste from the New Press. I look forward to that, for sure. Next, we will have Ken Knabb speak. Ken Knabb grew up in the Midwest, and in 1965, he moved to Berkeley, where he was immersed in the political and countercultural upheavals of the 60s. In 1969, he discovered the Situationists International, a small avant-garde group that had helped provoke the May 1968 revolt in France, a revolt that was itself often referred to as an occupation movement, since it involved occupations of workplaces, schools, and other buildings by millions of people throughout France. Inspired by the Situationists, Ken and some of his friends experimented with their own similar agitations. He also visited Situationist-influenced people in France and several other countries, and eventually translated a large number of Situationist writings from French into English, including the Situationist International Anthology and Guy Debord's The Society of the Spectacle. Ken's own writings have been published in the book Public Secrets, Collected Skirmishes of Ken Knabb, And all of his writings and translations can be found at his Bureau of Public Secrets website, www.bopsecrets.org. Next, we will have Pamela Nagalas. Pam is a member of Platypus Affiliated Society and a historian who's written on American history. I don't know if Pam, you wanted to say anything else, but this is the description that I have. That's good?
Yeah, I sent you a little bio. It's fine. That's fine.
Okay. And then next we will have Gerald Smith. Gerald was a member of Occupy Oakland, the Peace and Freedom Party, and activist with the Oscar Grant Committee. Perfect. So to begin, Arun, you have 12 minutes. So when you're ready, the floor is yours.
Oh, you're muted.
You're muted. Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
We can hear you now. Yep, go ahead.
Okay, sorry about that. So I think kind of an interesting way to frame what I'm going to say is, how did the last decade of left politics go from the anarchist and horizontalist rejection of the political and economic system, the form, to socialism and electoral politics? Because if we look at the trajectory over the last decade, that's really what's happened. But at the same time, the last decade, as I argue, is really the decade of Occupy Wall Street. So I'm just going to do a quick survey. There are a number of points I want to make. And I want to actually start off and take on one, I think, big myth. It's something I've been hearing actually since 2011, that the police ended Occupy. Obviously, there was a lot of police violence, a lot of police repression, but the police did not end Occupy. Part of the problem with this formulation is that if we were to look at the genesis of Occupy Wall Street, and I was there from day one, it was, if you're going to argue the police ended Occupy, you would have to also argue that the police built Occupy, because it was police violence in particular that caused the explosive growth of Occupy Wall Street at various junctures. First, it was 1 week with the incident where the women were pepper sprayed in Union Square Park. That caused Occupy to explode across New York City. Then the following week was the march and kettling on the Brooklyn Bridge of 700 people, their arrest that went on for hours. That was live streamed for people to see. That caused Occupy to explode across the nation and the world. Then there was a number of other incidents. Scott Olson, the Iraq War vet who was shot in the head at Occupy Oakland. The Oakland General Strike, I believe, was shortly after that, which was really one of the high points. There was a pepper spray incident at UC Davis, the chemical weapons attack on the elderly woman, Dorley Rainey, and on and on and on, that you can see these incidents. And what they really did is it paralyzed the state in city after city, that they didn't know how to act. And what they were seeing was that the police violence was actually causing the public to flock to Occupy Wall Street. So if you're going to argue that the police ended it, you have to also argue that the police helped its explosive growth inadvertently, of course. And the other thing is, too, one thing that I travel the country with my partner, Michelle Fawcett. She's was doing short films about the movement. And we saw in city after city that the initial marches, other than New York City and Oakland, were often the high points. In other words, that's what brought out the most people on the street. And so the movement basically started dwindling after that. Now, in terms of what Occupy was, I often argue that there are different ways to read it. It's like a novel. Was it a pro-democracy movement? Was it a debtors movement? I think we should see it as a workers' movement. because it involved foremost all sorts of people who had been basically forced out of work. In 2011, the real unemployment rate was still close to 16%. So 1 out of 6 Americans was unemployed, underemployed, or forced out of the workforce. There were retirees in there. There was students who had all this debt and they couldn't enter the workforce. So I think we should see it as a workers' movement. Another important aspect of Occupy was it was not merely a tactic. Occupy was fundamentally a strategy. It brought the movement into being. It brought the 99% into being, because the difference with Occupy, we had gotten used to bad theater on the left, like the Iraq anti-war marches, where people would go, just the same old marching in the street, same old chants, same old speakers. But Occupy was this living, breathing experiment and in community, this village. And by having a physical occupation of the space and things like the General Assembly and mic check, for one, it allowed people to come in, and I would watch people give their stories about how I had lost my job, I had lost my health care, I had lost my house, I have all this student debt, retirees who are like, I have had my pension cut. And they were able to see that they had this commonality in terms of, this suffering, but that there was also a common enemy. But more than that, the act of physically running an occupation meant that it equalized everyone in a way that left politics normally didn't. You didn't need all this theory. You didn't need to know all this jargon or inside language. You could come in with basic skills. If you knew how to cook, if you had carpentry or electrical skills, or if you could just do physical labor, you were welcomed in as the beloved member of the community. And it created a space also for a lot of people who were houseless to come into Occupy. Now, in terms of what Occupy did, I think it's important to note that saying that it failed, I think, misinterprets what went on. It was the expectations were so outlandish, which was great, that it was never going to meet people's dream of toppling the system, of creating the new world in the shell of the old. So I think to say that it failed just misunderstands what it was, because the real problem with why Occupy did not build on itself is it was that the left, there was no large organized left force that could come into it and take this energy and put it into some other project. So instead what you saw was liberal groups and labor unions come in and co-opt a lot of that energy. And things like the Occupy Spring, the 99% movement, SEIU did the Fight for 15, which they presented as an Occupy style upsurge of independent fast food workers, even though it was a minutely organized labor campaign. And we saw this kind of like on and on. There's also the People's Climate March, which liberal groups came in and co-opted that. And I can explain that more in the Q&A, what was behind that. There's another thing called the Democracy Spring that tried to do an Occupy style upsurge in 2016. So there was a lot of liberal co-optation. Another aspect of Occupy that I think gets misunderstood or downplayed is you'll hear people say, oh, it didn't do anything, it's a big deal. It gave us this like 99% and 1%. And this is actually huge. Because what it did was give us a vernacular class language back for the first time. And this is something that is very easily understandable. I've heard Walmart cashiers use terms like the 99% or 1% or labor activists who weren't involved in Occupy Wall Street. And it gives a very visceral understanding of socioeconomic class in a way that we haven't had in this society in perhaps a century. It says there is this enemy, this owning class, and there's the rest of us. And this has been fundamental, I think, to the growth of socialist politics over the last decade. Now, the other thing, if we look at what has happened over the last decade, the legacy, as I mentioned, includes Fight for 15. It includes the election of Shama Sawant in Seattle, the first socialist, and we've seen other socialists elected since. She came out of Occupy. It gave back Occupy resurrected militant street protests and direct action from the global justice movement that had basically been quashed by 9/11. And it's not merely a coincidence that Occupy Wall Street began almost to the day on the 10th anniversary of the September 11th attacks in the shadow of the fallen World Trade Center. So we see these kind of militant street tactics that are used in the climate justice movement with blockades in the land and sea and even the air. There was an incident in Portland where Greenpeace activists rappelled from a bridge and hung from lines to block an oil ship that was going to the Arctic. Occupy played an instrumental role in Bernie Sanders campaigns and also the squad and socialist candidates in Congress and the local level. There was Occupy ICE. Black Lives Matter activists say Occupy played a role by giving it a left edge. But I think, there's also was downsides to Occupy, not just the co-optation, but we've seen things, I think, like Occupy Sandy, I think in particular, which I went to and I was talking to a lot of people, despite the sloganeering that it's mutual aid, not charity. It most certainly was charity. There was not a political project that was tied to Occupy Sandy. And that's not to say it didn't do very important work for the first week or two where the state had abandoned all these people, but the reality is that it just ended up being essentially a social service project where you saw the state dumping a lot of responsibility on these unpaid volunteers, and there wasn't any actual organizing that came out of it. I think one of the most important legacies of Occupy Wall Street is the reason it succeeded. It was so open, but that was also the reason why it failed. Its strength was its weakness. And what we see coming out, the development is that what the left needs now more than ever is strategy, organization, leadership, and discipline, which you're starting to see to a degree within DSA and the labor movement. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was a wonderful presentation. Ken, when you're ready. Ready? You just have to unmute yourself.
Sorry. Okay. Now can you hear me? All right. Thank you. I'm going, during the Occupy movement, I wrote a number of leaflets and so on that I either distributed or posted on my website. And often about Occupy Oakland, some details. And then I had a general leaflet that I'll show you here that I wrote, and I'm going to quote from that a little bit later. That was in the early weeks of Occupy. But what I'm going to do for my presentation here is a year after Occupy, about October 2012, I was interviewed via email from a French journal, a radical French journal. And it was about the exact topic we're talking about here. They said, looking back, what do you think about Occupy? What was it all about? Any lessons, innovations, and so on. So I'm going to read just a few selections from my answers. One of their questions was, looking back, what do you see as the movement's most significant features or innovations? And I responded, there were several. Some were genuine innovations. Others were inspired by recent struggles in other countries, notably Argentina, Tunisia, Egypt, Greece, and Spain. the Arab Spring and so on. So these are some of the things that I thought were significant. One, the fact that its agenda was open and everyone was welcome. It called on people to come together to seek practical solutions to the problems we are all facing, but it did not prejudge what those solutions might be. People put all sorts of differences aside, at least for the time being, and agreed to come together amicably. For everyone who came and spoke up, even people with dramatically differing views. This openness was a radical break with almost all previous radical movements. And it was undoubtedly one of the main reasons that so many people were won over so quickly. Two, at the same time, it suggested a provocative terrain for those gatherings. Quote, exercise your right to peaceably assemble, occupy public space, unquote. This uncertain semi-legal terrain provided just enough edge to keep the discussions from being too academic. There's nothing like wondering whether the police will move in to arrest you, to encourage speaking to the point and sticking to practicalities. Three, from the very beginning, it was apparent to everyone that this was a participatory movement, not just something you might watch from afar. In most cities and even in many towns, all you had to do to find out about it was to go visit the local encampment, look around, ask questions. You could walk right in and immediately take part in the assemblies. For many people, this was the first time in their life that they had gotten a taste of real democracy in action, however limited. This cut through the usual social isolation and spectator passivity, undermining the lies and misconceptions that prevail when people depend solely on what they've imbibed from the mass media. Four, the occupiers' unexpected refusal to specify any particular demand. This reflected the understanding that there are innumerable issues and that they are all interconnected, that it is our whole social system and in fact our whole way of life that is at stake. Five, the fact that it spread so widely and rapidly. Many of us were used to the idea that American radical activity mostly took place in the larger cities on the two coasts and had despaired of the vast regions of conservative and clueless mid-America. In contrast to many other countries, the United States seemed too large and too uncentralized to lend itself to the spread of a radical movement. In contrast, France, with its dominant central city, numerous times a comparatively small number of people have initiated a revolt in Paris, which then rapidly spread to the rest of the country via the existing networks of communication and transportation. Thus, when I first heard about Occupy Wall Street, my initial thought was, wow, that looks great. Who knows if this continues, maybe it will eventually inspire movements like that in one or two other cities. And 2 weeks later, it had spread to hundreds of other cities. So that just blew my mind, including in many conservative parts of the country. Six, the movement was able to spread like this due to the internet and other social media. As in Tunisia and Egypt, the Arab Spring, people used Facebook, Twitter, blogs, and other interactive forms of communication to organize their actions, to share experiences, and to analyze and criticize their practices in real time. Most revolts of the past had to depend on much slower and clunkier forms of communication. Leaflets, phone calls, snail mail, or worse yet, had to hope that their actions and aims would be reported without too much distortion by the mass media. Now, people saw online videos of assemblies in New York and other cities and immediately decided to set up similar occupations in their own communities, then posted videos and reports about their own actions that might in turn inspire others. This was happening while the mainstream media was not even mentioning the movement. That was during the first week. There was literally nothing. But meanwhile, millions of people were, the movement effectively created its own alternative networks of communication and publicity while almost totally bypassing and ignoring the mainstream media. 7, this manner of spreading also had the unforeseen effect of creating an unusual degree of autonomy among the different occupies. As I noted in my leaflet, The Awakening in America, quote, each of the new occupations and assemblies remains totally autonomous. Though inspired by the original Wall Street occupation, they have all been created by the people in their own communities. No outside person or group has the slightest control over any of these assemblies, which is just as it should be, unquote. This autonomy was so obvious that no one could have denied it. Yet oddly enough, I don't recall anyone else ever noting its importance. Amid all the differences between the occupies in different cities, no one ever dared to suggest that any occupy should defer to any other. As I went on to note in the leaflet, this had 2 great advantages, quote, the proliferation of autonomous groups and actions is safer and more fruitful than the top-down, quote, unity for which bureaucrats are always appealing. Safer because it counteracts repression. If the occupation in one city is crushed or co-opted, the movement will still be alive and well in 100 others. More fruitful because this diversity enables people to share and compare among a wider range of tactics and ideas, unquote. And finally, this is what I noted in my earlier leaflet about the situationist influence. I quoted the editor of Adbusters, which was a publication and group that originally announced the date and publicized this. So they were one of the elements in kicking off the whole movement. And there, in an interview, the editor of that said, we are not just inspired by what happened in the Arab Spring recently, we are also students of the situationist movement. Those are the people who gave birth to what many people think was the first global revolution back in 1968, when some uprisings in Paris suddenly inspired uprisings all over the world. All of a sudden, universities and cities were exploding. This was done by a small group of people, the situationists, who were like the philosophical backbone of the movement. One of the key guys was Guy Debord, who wrote The Society of the Spectacle. The idea was that if you have a very powerful meme, a very powerful idea, and the moment is ripe, that is enough to ignite a revolution. This is the background that we come out of, unquote. And so I go on to mention the May 68 revolt in France was in fact also an occupation movement. One of its most notable features was the occupation of the Sorbonne University and other public buildings, which then inspired the occupation of factories all over the country by more than 10 million workers. All that happened within the space of 2 or 3 weeks. Needless to say, we are still very far from something like that, which can hardly happen in America until workers bypass their union bureaucracies and take collective action on their own, as they did in France. So I'd like to end my presentation with, on this first leaflet that I showed you, I put an epigraph from another work of mine called The Joy of Revolution that I had published in 1997. And in that, I kind of set out the sort of geography of revolutions, how some revolutions start, what happens, and so on. And so here I'm talking about radical situations. You will see that occupies this. A radical situation is a collective awakening. In such situations, people become much more open to new perspectives, readier to question previous assumptions, quicker to see through the usual cons. People learn more about society in a week than in years of academic social studies or leftist consciousness raising. Everything seems possible, and much more is possible. People can hardly believe what they used to put up with in the old days. Passive consumption is replaced by active communication. Strangers strike up lively discussions on street corners. Debates continue around the clock. New arrivals constantly replacing those who depart for other activities or to try to catch a few hours of sleep, though they are usually too excited to sleep very long. Bystanders get drawn into the vortex and go through astonishingly rapid changes. Radical situations are the rare moments when qualitative change really becomes possible. Far from being abnormal, they reveal how abnormally repressed we usually are. They make our normal life seem like sleepwalking. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ken. Thank you. Pam, when you're ready, thank you very much for that.
Yep, thanks. My name is Pamela Nagalas. I'm a founding member of Platypus. I'm also a host of the podcast Shit Platypus Says, and I'm a historian of transatlantic reform. The following comments are comments that I've delivered at the Platypus International Convention on our panel Reflections on Occupy that both Danny and I were part of. So I look forward to the discussion afterwards, which may bring up some of these points, but if you've heard this presentation, this is pretty much a reprisal. Occupy erupted in 2011 after the revolt of the Tea Party, a populist expression of discontent from the right, which provoked a renewal among the Republican Party base. In the shadow of the economic turn amidst global austerity protests, the Sakoti Park occupiers looked to the rebellions in Cairo, Tunis, Athens, and London. They were inspired by the forms of organization and mobilization at Tahrir Square and the popular assemblies in Madrid's Puerta del Sol, but directed most of their discontent against the government bailout. After New York City, copycat protests spread to hundreds of cities on every continent. It was an explosion, otherwise unprecedented in my lifetime, a spontaneous expression of popular discontent that cut across the political spectrum at first. In their call for the Wall Street occupation, the Situationist magazine Adbusters published attractive photographs of gas-masked anarchists lurking in the fog of the People's War and advancing towards Wall Street's charging bull. On September 17th, when hundreds descended on Sakoti, the chant broke out. Banks got bailed out. We got sold out. In response to this Main Street versus Wall Street politics of the common sense occupier, Platypus flyered the park with a printout of the 2008 Platypus Review article, Finance Capital, Why Finance Capitalism is No More Fictitious Than Any Other Kind. It read, an authentically Marxist left should take no side in the present debates over the merits and pitfalls of the bailout of the financial system. One can and should critique this, of course, but nonetheless remain aware that this is no simple matter of opposing it. This side of revolutionary emancipation beyond capital, a Marxian politics would demand to better finance capital, no less than to support labor. But our flyer fell on deaf ears. The Marxian left was not visible. A wayward sectarian might fight his way into a meeting, but the early days of Occupy were dominated by anarchists and liberals. Anti-globalization veteran and cultural anthropologist David Graeber, alongside the liberal Chris Hedges, were the poster boys for the Gen X ideologues. This generation hardly took responsibility for its leadership, and there was leadership, right? Except at our panels, at Platypus panels. Quote, since this is a matter of some historical contention, Graeber admitted in his brief autobiography, he was in fact, quote, the first to suggest that they call themselves the 99%. But he objected to being given sole credit. He said, 2 Spanish indignados and a Greek anarchist added the we, and later a Food Not Bombs veteran put the R between them. The ruling class, Graeber said at our 2012 London panel, was actually terrified of the people. He believed people had to free their imaginations and imagine an alternative configuration of life, just like the people of Madagascar, whom he studied in his ethnographic work. People, wherever they are and at whatever scale, can produce other forms of social life. We were already free, but only through direct action, participatory democracy, that is, rather than representative democracy, could we build an anarchist society, what he called, quote, democracy without government, bound by mutual aid and compassion. I see anarchism more as a way of doing things, he wrote, a broad series of ethical commitments and principles rather than an ideology. For Graeber, morality could either stifle these efforts or encourage them. According to his logic, people pay their debts because they feel morally obliged to do it, even when they recognize it is unjust. To them, his reply seemed to be, just don't do it, man. Quit your bullshit job and free your mind. In 2011, his book, Debt, The First 5,000 Years, Graeber boasted about success of the anti-globalization movement in achieving debt forgiveness for third world countries. This was the pinnacle of anarchism as a type of dishonest liberalism, or what we might call liberalism in hysterics. The anti-authoritarian moral impulse was the default organizational principle at the park. It was, as Chris Catrone wrote, a configuration of politics on the left, that is the leaderless and horizontal movement celebrated by such writers as Michael Hart to Antonio Negri, John Holloway, etc. A dominant theme in the self-understanding of the 1990s era left was, as in the current occupation movement, resistance rather than pressing for reforms, let alone revolution. Platypus learned that the 1970s was the last time that the left tried to organize for power. The 1980s was characterized by institutionalized protest, including varieties of Stalinist popular frontism, such as South African and Central American solidarity campaigns, and academic leftism. The 1990s left, that is Graeber's generation, was more deliberately post-Marxist and hence post-political. The anarchists of the Graeberite variety were facilitators in the General Assembly, the primary organization through which decisions were made in the park. Christened Liberty Plaza or Liberty Square, depending on whom you asked, the new temporary autonomous zone on Sakoti Park was lively with cleaning crews, a kitchen, a library, and of course the sleeping quarters, which were unpleasant from the standpoint of comfort and cleanliness, but showed a sincere commitment to staying until, but that until was unclear. Among those facilitating the park conversations was Marissa Holmes, an old contact from our early days in the New Students for a Democratic Society, and a panelist in the first iteration of Platypus's 3 Rs, Reform, Revolution, Resistance panel, which we ended up hosting again as a result of Occupy. Marissa had spent the summer filming protesters in Egypt and came back with a fire in her belly, ready to turn the discontent after the bailout into fuel for a utopian experiment of mutual aid. It was all very muddy, confused. Platypus wanted to pin it down. What did the occupiers want? In November, journalist Chris Hedges was arrested when he and others staged a people's hearings on the activities of the investment bank Goldman Sachs and blocked the entrance to their corporate headquarters. He and the anarchists agreed on one thing. They wanted a genuine democracy. A last player I want to introduce is Alexa O'Brien, the journalist who had created an extensive archive of the only available pretrial transcripts of the court-martialed of accused WikiLeaks source Chelsea Manning. O'Brien also covered the Arab Spring for WikiLeaks. In the lead up to Occupy, she had started a campaign to demand free and fair elections. O'Brien called it the US Day of Rage, after the Days of Rage series of violent actions organized by the Weather Underground in 1969. She felt that, quote, something needed to be done to help people and have a space where they could discuss these issues and their self-interest without ideological talking points. And she realized that most of the grievances, quote, whether left or right, could be linked to corrupt elections. There was a point at which the US Day of Rage was considered the true force behind Occupy, and their social media accounts became the source for Occupy updates across the liberal news outlets. At the beginning, it seemed that at least some people behind OWS were trying to attract people to the park who may have ended up at a Tea Party meeting. By mid-October, Occupy had an approval rating of more than 50%, higher than President Obama or Congress. I remember going to the park one evening and seeing some workers wearing purple armbands. When I asked them what they stood for, they said that they were the colors of the American flag combined, and that they wore them because, quote, this movement is not anti-American. Rather, they were against the elite, against the bankers, against them. The Declaration of Occupation of New York City read, in part, quote, they have taken the bailouts from taxpayers with impunity and continue to give executives exorbitant bonuses. They determine economic policy despite the catastrophic failures of their policies and what they have produced and continue to produce. They purposefully keep people misinformed and fearful through their control of the media. It's about this time when Trump started to get serious with his first presidential bid. And although his 2012 campaign came to an end prematurely, he formally bowed out and said that he was not ready to leave the private sector. We can already see in the popular discontent of the Tea Party and the protesters of Wall Street that there was plenty of material for a shift in the American political base. People were fed up on all sides. As we saw in the years after, the 99% rhetoric was taken hook, line, and sinker by the Democratic Party presidential candidate Bernie Sanders. In the end, both parties grabbed the slogans of Occupy and ran with them, and we are still in this moment. The confused cry of protest rang out from Liberty Square. One could hear competing slogans: fight, fight, education is a right, followed by 2, 4, 6, 8, eat the rich and smash the state. Okay, so which one is it? Pleas for federal regulation of finance were happening alongside teach-ins on alternative currencies. Declarations of war against the ruling class were followed by visits from the economist Joseph Stiglitz. Naomi Klein and Zizek pontificated over the People's Mic about getting serious. Jay-Z and Russell Simmons gave money, and Mayor Bloomberg, surely aware of the media frenzy that the park had become, let the protesters stay under the watchful eye of the NYPD. But the Marxists were nowhere to be seen. Ben Blumberg and I, then members of Platypus's organizational committee, argued about whether or not Platypus should have anything to do with this movement. What should we do? Go to the park, bring them to campus, hand out Platypus reviews? We had spent the first 4 years of Platypus as students of Marx and Marxism, arguing with Marxist sectarians, taking Marxism and its history seriously. But Occupy was a different creature altogether. At first, we held capital and history teach-ins and Communist Manifesto teach-ins, both in Chicago and New York. But these went nowhere. The park was not a place to think, to reflect, to consider anything of substance. The People's Mic actually prevented people from having any reflective distance from what anyone said. In the end, we pushed to take the activists out of the park and into campuses so that we could take stock of what was happening. This proved tricky. Anarchists refused to speak as panelists to an audience that went against the assembly model, so they refused to teach. One night, while promoting our events on campus at the park, an anarchist started to scream in my face. You cannot take the people away from the occupation. The whole point is the occupation, that's it. So I jumped from one working group to another, true story, pitching our little gamble to host the conversation on the left. We started with a series of roundtable discussions with Occupy activists around the globe. In the first one in New York City, we included a veteran of the Seattle '99 protests, a facilitator of the General Assembly, a Grey Bright anarchist, a member of the Electoral Reform Working Group, a DSA member and editor of Jacobin magazine, Chris Maisano, who at the time was part of the Demands Working Group. As it turned out, the Demands Working Group was where the self-identified socialist had ended up, and the anarchists wanted them out. Maisano clarified in his opening remarks that despite the slander, they were not a Marxist cabal trying to take over the movement. In the end, however, they were the real winners of the whole mobilization. The founding of Jacobin in 2011 helped to build a common front between N+1, Verso, historical materialism, and the rest as the Marxists, who were serious about demands. Platypus, however, wasn't taking sides in this debate. Because of this, we were accused of betrayal, elitism, sectarianism. The via negativa nature of our work confused them. It became apparent with our engagement with the left over the course of Occupy that we may have only negative lessons to learn. In the demands working group, the DSA called for 25 million jobs, Medicare for all, a free higher education through dramatically rising taxes on the rich, and ending all American wars. As Maisano put it in our roundtable, I fail to see how these can be co-opted. His Keynesian imagination and the DSA's nostalgia for the New Deal was the target of anarchists' ire. Maisano said that he had arrived at his support for progressive reforms through the lessons of the Second International. Reform and revolution cannot be counterposed. The demands, he clarified, were, quote, not just directed at the state, but to the people out there who are heartened that we are protesting Wall Street, but need something more in their lives than hanging out with people at the park. He was a socialist, a Marxist, he said, and he didn't want to be stuck in meetings for 10 hours a day. Unions were serious, while the anarchists in the invisible committee behind the General Assembly were irresponsible activists who were squandering an opportunity. He had a point, but so did the anarchists who wanted nothing to do with the Democratic Party. On the other side of Maisano were those who rallied behind the formula, occupy everything, demand nothing, no concession to the reformists. A fringe but vocal faction of the anarchists on the park, self-described insurrectionary communization types, became increasingly disruptive at meetings, at the site of union leadership specifically. They opposed the Graberites at their council working groups, the General Assembly, etc. They were convinced, as the Invisible Committee wrote in The Coming Insurrection, that, quote,
Can you start to just find that you're ending?
Yes, I am 2 paragraphs away from the end. That they were convinced, as the Invisible Committee wrote in The Coming Insurrection, that every organization that claims to contest the present order mimics the form, mores, language, and of miniature states, thus far from every impulse to do politics differently, has only contributed to the indefinite spread of the state's tentacle. These anti-civilization anarchists wanted to tear shit down. Once freed from society, they hoped to return to some kind of lost communal bond between people. The rejection of demands in the first 2 months of the occupation was built as a bulwark against the major New York unions and the quote unquote Marxist, in particular the DSAers and the demands working group. OWS gained the support of the AFL-CIO, not only of the local branches, but of the national leadership. When the New York police jailed occupiers marching on the Brooklyn Bridge, transport workers, school teachers, and municipal employees joined OWS for the biggest march of the New York occupation. Just like in Seattle '99, the anarchist and organized labor originally stepped out together, but organized labor differed on the ends of the occupation. They hoped that OWS could be like the Tea Party, but for the Democratic Party. OWS, in other words, offered an opportunity to put pressure on the Democrats. On one occasion, at a late hour of the night, when an endless meeting of the General Assembly appeared to go nowhere, union members left in a huff and walked over to Tompkins Square Park. I followed them, along with a member of the League for Revolutionary Party, who was an ex-member of the Spartacus Youth League and part of the Platypus Reading Group at the time. It seemed to us that the unions had decided that the meetings at Security Park were going nowhere. So the grown-ups needed to talk now about the actual bargain they wanted to make before the 2012 election. To them, it was plain and simple. The rest, as Platypus learned, was the cry before accommodation. Looking back at the years leading up to Occupy and reflecting on our participation during the anti-war movement, we can see how the young leaders in the new SDS, who had been mentored in the Chomskyan Paracon perspective of Z magazine writers like Michael Albert, had formed the quote unquote anti-ideological core of the new SDS. Once the anti-war movement failed by turning itself into a campaign for Obama, this bias, the creeping anti-Marxism, returned with a vengeance in the occupation movement. But what the anarchists represented alongside the DSA was the endless postponement of the question of Bonapartism, the question of the dictatorship of the proletariat, and thus of Marxist politics altogether. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Pam. That was great. Gerald, when you're ready, just have to unmute yourself. Yep.
Wow. Unmute yourself. I did. Can you
We can hear
me
you.
now?
We can hear you. Yeah.
Okay. You know what? I am. Wow. I've never heard 3 people, 3 different perspectives, but I saw a common thread of intelligence through these presentations, and I myself don't have that type of presentation. But what I do have is I have a fading memory, and I went around and I talked to people that had been in the occupation movement here in Oakland. And I'm going to try to share some of those ideas with you. This may not be deeply theoretical, but I think it will be valuable. Okay, so everybody's already pointed out the moment that Occupy began, and that is Obama and the Tea Party and stuff like that. And I'm glad you did, because to tell you the truth, I was not very impressed with Occupy Wall Street. And when we started this Occupy here in the Bay Area, particularly in Oakland, because Oakland far and away was the most powerful Occupy that I saw up and down the coast. And I will go on to, and I'm not, saying my city. It's just factually like what actually happened. I think we wound up getting a lot of people from outlining areas like Walnut Creek and little smaller areas where there were fewer, left wingers, and kind of it acted as a magnet to kind of pull them in to Oakland. Because I can tell you, initially, I agree when people say that the Occupy movement was a workers' movement. There's no question the first, I guess 1 month, we occupied downtown Oakland, the amphitheater and that area. So there were hundreds of tents. Workers, unfortunately, cannot, have to work for a living. They're workers. So as those workers had to go back to work, the anarchists thought that it was cool to have homeless people occupy those tents to give the appearance that this was a massive movement. In fact, there were Democratic Party participants. Desi Woods, who was the city council person from District 6, had a tent. Jean Quan, who was the mayor of the city of Oakland, had a faction inside of Occupy Oakland. At one point, when we were debating and resistance to giving up the space, Jean Quan's faction left in mass. That was kind of interesting. Okay, so I just want to, I'm agreeing with Pam that in fact, if I recall, I pay attention to polls, okay? Not that I live by them, I just pay attention to them. And I was shocked that Occupy had more respect amongst the working people, according to these polls. Amherst, Massachusetts was one of the polls I pay attention to. And it was something like the Congress, who do you look to for leadership was the question. The Congress got 10%, Obama got 14%, the Tea Party got 16%. And then Occupy got something like 20-something%. And I was kind of flabbergasted when I noticed that. And I started to think about, well, maybe this is a little more important than I think it is. But myself, I had been through the circular firing squads of, let's say groups like the Spartacus League, et cetera, et cetera. And it was kind of refreshing to see a social movement, because in Oakland, there could be between 200 and 2,000 people every night convening in this amphitheater, 14th and Broadway. We called it Oscar Grant Plaza. Okay, we had called it Oscar Grant Plaza for a while. Okay, so in fact, I thought it was kind of healthy, because some little cult-like group tried to intervene to get the name changed of Occupy Oakland to decolonize Oakland, And what's really nice, the Black people, of which they're at the height of Black participation, there was 40% Black people involved in Occupy Oakland. That was different from every other Occupy, and it's just different, okay? And I could get into why in a minute, but I thought that it was very interesting that Black people rejected that old nonsense about decolonization. And in fact, that's why it lost, is because of the Black participation. And that shows you how unconnected a lot of these groups, sects, cults, cliques that claim that they represent the interest of the community, how disconnected they are from the community. It's just a small indicator. Okay, so just to tell you though, there was all kinds of, so the GAs occurred every night, and they were not 100% consensus. We made them, I believe, and I might be wrong, but I believe that they were like 80%, that a vote had to be 80%, okay? And I believe that we had, I don't believe, I know we had committees that functioned, very functional committees. I personally was in, when we had a labor solidarity committee, which basically did strike chasing. We went and joined the picket lines of any workers that were in active strikes. We had the Occupy Oakland Education Committee, and that, we actually put out a little journal. Yeah, we were able to, put out a little journal called Education for the 99%. And it was pretty decent. The quality of it, was pretty decent. It was not some anarchist trash. It was, yes, I said that, by the way. But because people wanted to put out stuff for teachers, parents, that they would read, so we and that was the education committee. After they attacked the police, and the police attacking does make a difference, by the way. They attacked our committee, and by the way, on the Black folks, I personally am not crazy about lumping people, illegal activity, et cetera, et cetera. The anarchists love losers, and they, and all of that. But I'm not into that. But I had to admit that it was a good thing that we had a positive relationship with the Lumpins, and actually won them over, because one, I was shocked to see they participated. And above all, I have to give the credit to them when the police attacked, the first attack on Occupy Oakland to take it down. The Lumpins were like, shoot, they must have been half of the fighting forces to put up resistance to the police. And I learned something, okay? I learned, you live, hopefully you learn. And I was very impressed by that. Okay, so I just wanted to go into the what you guys still call the general strike. We got to learn it was not a general strike. It was a mass, a very large and mass protest. It was particularly against the shutting down of Occupy Oakland. No, a lot of people took off from work, but it did not stop capitalism in the city of Oakland. It did not totally stop capitalism. It slowed it down because the pigs said that we had 5,000 people at the thing. Oh God. Well, just let me control the anger in this report. In fact, I found out almost months later, unfortunately, 100,000 people showed up to the waterfront on November 2nd. 100,000 people. That's impressive, but it's not a general strike. Well, call it what you will. I'm not going to get into arguments over labels. The point is, it was a massive event. And that was the shutdown committee. I told you about the Labor Solidarity Committee supporting strikes, and I told you about the Education Committee. Now, I did want to talk about working class.
1 minute left, just 1 minute left.
Okay, so
Yep.
so I just want to say there are many different movements, organizations that started off inside of the Occupy movement. And I could get into some of the negative stuff, but the Oscar Grant Committee swole up. And I think that was a mistake that we made by entering the Occupy movement as opposed to working, maintaining our independence, because we swole up to huge numbers that were not manageable, and we participated. But then as soon as the Occupy movement waned, so did we, and that was not good. That was not good. I just wanted to say, it's the debt movement was there in the Occupy, and it continued. The Occupy Oakland Education Committee continued as a union function called, it was called Classroom Struggle, and it actually exists today. The parts of it exist today. And I want to not go on, not because I don't have anything else to say, but because of our time constraints. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Gerald. That was fantastic. So now we're going to go to the responses between the panelists portion of the panel. As this is happening, the audience, if you can start formulating your questions and just kind of, writing them out so that you can put them in the Q&A down at the bottom of the screen. I just wanted to read the questions again before we go around in responses, which will just be 3 minutes max. What was the meaning of Occupy, and how does it make sense in light of the recent and distant historical experience on the left? So I believe Ken and Arun brought up kind of the way in which it brought people into politics in a way that maybe wasn't the case in the preceding era. How did the experience of Occupy change how we think about the legacy of the left? So Pam and Gerald and Ken brought up kind of different trends of the left in the past, so situationist, the Marxian left, the dictatorship of the proletariat, and how have the lessons learned or not learned from Occupy affected the future horizons of leftist politics? So we can think today in 2021, after 2 major elections, after Trump, after Bernie Sanders, after the DSA, et cetera. So if we can start with Arun, your responses to the rest of the panelists. And also, we just have to unmute when you're speaking. And Gerald, if you could mute.
No problem.
Yeah, I think generally it is what it is. I think trying to project something on Occupy that it needed to be this way or needed to be that way, just again, I think it misunderstands it. So on September 17th, I was at the initial march gathering at Battery Park, and folks marched around to like 6 different spots, and it was kind of in the end accidental that they settled on Zuccotti Park, where it took off. It was just they were looking for some convenient place, and that was the one that they found. There was a plan, but the other spaces weren't really available. And so the first night, it was just like a couple of dozen people, I think virtually or all men, white men. But what struck me about it was interesting is they had just come from all over the country. I met someone from there's some people from New York, but Vermont, Texas, California, and I liken it to Close Encounters of the Third Kind, where it's just like they were drawn there, but they couldn't actually say why. And so from there, it slowly grew during the first week. But the thing is, Occupy was one of the only times, and I've been involved in politics for like 30 years, and have studied the history. And I think you'd really have to go back to the 1930s in the United States to find a time where Occupy was really, where the left was occupying the political center. Certainly the 60s movements were profound, but Occupy was really, I think, captured the imagination of the public in the way that the left has rarely ever done before in the last century. And so I saw all sorts of efforts to try and take Occupy in one direction or another. Post eviction of Zuccotti Park, there was like Occupy Our Homes, or a campaign against Bank of America, or Occupy Evolve, or there was attempts to continue Occupy Wall Street with all these large public meetings, and none of them really worked out. And the thing is that I think it would have taken a very large left organization, something with thousands and thousands of cadre, to basically patiently work with people and to absorb activists into on-the-ground political projects for it to have some sort of meaningful effect. And what we did see is things like SEIU hiring all these Occupy activists to basically serve as the grunts, the frontline organizers in the Fight for 15 campaign, or as I mentioned, the liberal co-optation with the 99% Spring. And if we talk about what Occupy did or didn't do, it's because there is really no organized militant left anymore, at least in not even at a mass level, but in a significant level anyway. And I think I try to be ecumenical, and I think there's positive aspects to DSA's growth, but it's not a cadre organization, and it's overly focused on electoral politics. I think to its detriment. Whereas what Occupy was trying to do was bring around extra systemic change, but there was never a strategy, and lots of people tried to create a strategy, but it never worked. And so that's why I say, look, when people talk about Occupy failing, the real issue is that the hopes were so wild and so dramatic that they were never going to be realized. And I think what we should do is take the lessons of one, that spontaneous organizing has a way of breaking through to the public that the left isn't able to do otherwise. But you have to figure out a way to institutionalize these gains into movements, into policies, and so on.
Great. Ken, would you like to respond to that?
Thank you. My impression when people say, did this work or did it fail or something, I think back like Marx and Engels, when they looked at the Commune, the Paris Commune, 1871. I'm just quoting from memory, but one of them said, the greatest victory of the Paris Commune was its own existence. And so obviously the Paris Commune failed. It was crushed and thousands of people were killed, and had this thing. But the significance of the commune that we can, it's 150 years ago now, was that there was something about its actual functioning, how it came about and how it functioned and how it got destroyed, that remained an inspiration that all kinds of other movements that might have said, oh, this movement succeeded, we got somebody elected, we got a law changed or something, that those kind of things do not remain, shall we say, inspiring. And I think the same thing about the May 68 revolt in France. Yeah, you can say it failed, it didn't change the world, but the people who were involved in that for a month or so, it was something that changed their lives. France was never the same after that. And I think that we can say the 60s in a sort of more vague way was like that in the US, but in France, that was a little more specific. And I think the Occupy movement deserves to be considered in the same way, that we can debate what this or that strand of it led to. This led to some political person or some political movement or social movement or whatever, and this led to betrayals and disappointments. But if you look at the Occupy movement itself, maybe the word miracle is not quite appropriate, but to me, it seems so astonishing that I'm not really concerned about this or that, that it didn't lead to something the following year, or that it didn't overthrow the government of the United States or overthrow capitalism or something. To me, it's such a rich experience that, like May 68 in France, here the whole country was like in a turmoil for more than a month. And then afterwards, people say, oh, well, it didn't overthrow the government or something. And, what do you expect? Of course, some movement just, coming out of nowhere is not going to do all that. It's filled with, people who are complete newbies of politics. But the fact that it existed is already remarkable, and that there's good reason why 10 years later we're still talking about it and we're not talking about a whole lot of other things. So personally, the 6 weeks at the beginning of Occupy were the happiest days of my life, without any comparison. And I don't want to say Occupy is good because it's a feel-good thing, but there's some reason, other social movements have not made me feel that way. I still think about it,
Great.
So, enough said.
Yeah, great. Fantastic. Pam, would you like to respond now?
Yeah, I guess the question is, what did we learn, right? Like things feel all sorts of ways. I don't know if I can relate to the same feeling after several 9-hour meetings. I don't know if I felt very good, but it did make me reflect, like now, years back, like what was it for? I wanted to, yeah, so I would agree, for example, with Aaron that, I'm not, the question is, what did we learn? And I don't think that the narrative of co-optation actually helps us try to understand what happened there. I think Gerald in his remarks talked about how all of the problems of the left presented themselves in miniature, in microcosm, right? Like once you start organizing people to transform the world, like all of the problems that exist on the left like reproduce themselves, right? Like unions taking in one particular direction, people that are tied to electoral politics as like real reform, anarchists who think that giving real reform is the concessions to the right, and it's just all reproduced itself. The problem was that also within that movement, no one wanted to take responsibility for its leadership. And so while it reproduced the problems, it didn't have ways to solve or attempt to solve those problems. And so, because as 1871, that Ken, you brought up, like what was there to learn, like the lessons to learn, the reason why its existence was so important is that it showed negatively, right, because it was a defeat, but nonetheless it gave a significant lesson, certainly to Lenin, of the necessity for state power and this problem of the state. And so like the lessons were of the state's Bonapartism and how to get from that problem to socialism, which we're still trying to understand that. And so I wanted to emphasize, though, that I didn't just want to, for lack of a better phrase, like shit on the anarchists, because I think that what I was hoping to like present was that, in fact, the people that were serious about their politics, the serious Marxists, did end up like propping electoral Democratic Party politics. And so in retrospect, you could say like the anarchists, even the ones that were the most frustrated, had a point, that they didn't want to just accept the status quo. They didn't want like all of the energy to be reabsorbed into the already existing political movements. But if you do think about the people that were attracted to the park in the beginning, if we are talking about working people, people that would have joined the Tea Party, people that, in other words, were not Democrats, right, that were part of the social discontent, like that was squandered. Like there was a sense that even if you measure Occupy by its own logic, by its own goals, like there was a squandering of an opportunity. And the thing was that the people that did take up the opportunity, let me wrap up. The people that did take up the opportunity were the existing political parties. So the Democrats and the Republicans gained from that, and the left didn't.
It looks like Gerald wants to say something. Was Gerald, when you're ready? Yeah.
How much time do I have?
You have like 3 minutes, and then we'll go to the Q&A. Yeah.
Okay. So look, now I was once in the Spartacus League, and I was trained as an ORO shark to destroy my opponents. Okay, and I've learned that may not be the best use of my time. You know that? And I've also learned to have some sympathy and respect for people that occupy the same side of the class line that I try to defend. Okay, so I just want to say I understand Ken, where Ken is coming from, and I understand the situationists to a certain extent. They've been around since the 30s. There was a relationship between Leon Trotsky and his Fourth International and the Situationists for a while. But I think the name betrays the reality. We ain't gonna just get over with no situation. We have to learn from our experience and go forward. And I think we have to go forward in an organizational way. Now, while I am currently a member of the DSA, I don't go around talking about that because I find them as a totalitarian social democratic party clique. And it's unhealthy. It's basically unhealthy. But at the same time, they do some very useful stuff. Now that's a contradiction. Well, that's what we're trying to understand right now. We have contradictions that we have to really look at carefully So I'm not putting you down, Ken, but I don't think that it's not enough to just say, I have to agree with, what's her name? Pam, that we need to try to figure out what went wrong. I can give you a long laundry list about what went wrong with Occupy Oakland, but above all, so that we can teach the young people. That's the key. So we learn from our past activities so that we can prepare for our future activity. And in that sense, celebrating Occupy is not enough. It's just not enough. We do have to try to figure it out and try to go forward. My 3 minutes is up. I don't want to take up too much time.
Thank you so much, Gerald. We're starting to have questions roll in, so I'm going to read the first question, and then I'll also put it in the chat box, but I need to read it first. The 99% is an imprecise analysis of class divisions. Do you think Occupy was able to break the US out of class denial and make a class analysis more accepted today? So this is about, the slogan that was brought up yeah, so Arun, go ahead. Yeah, I can see you unmuted yourself.
Oh, okay. I was just gonna
let's go to Arun first because he brought it up.
No problem.
Well, of course it's imprecise. I mean, do you want people to go around chanting "We are the 99.99%"? The whole point of a slogan is it's just something simple and elegant that captures a certain truth at the moment and resonates with people. But I think yes, it most certainly has. Look, Occupy flipped the conversation from Tea Party austerity to income inequality and now wealth inequality, and that is still with us a decade later. And so it very much, I think, helped to introduce much more of an popular idea of class, certainly not like, some sort of deep theoretical or historical understanding of what class is, either in economic or social terms, but it resonated throughout society, and people get it in a way they haven't before. And so yes, it's imprecise, but so what? So is like no blood for oil, the slogan during the Iraq War. I mean, workers of the world unite, you have nothing to lose but your chains. I mean, if it's not a theoretical platform. It's meant to inspire people. There's all sorts of problems with that. If we were going to use that as some sort of like a strategy guide, but that's not. It's confusing what the role of a slogan is with how I think like the nitty gritty of politics and organizing work.
Do you think, you mentioned the workers of the world unite, right, out of the Communist Manifesto. It seemed like the question was asking if actually that would be a more precise slogan. In other words, that would bring up the class divisions, whereas maybe the question was asking that it's kind of like majority versus minority, which can definitely be galvanizing, but it's not quite the same as a class division.
Again, it is what it is. I think, I've been around on the left a long time, and people have been like, you have plenty of little, Trotskyists and Marxist Leninists and Maoist sects screaming about workers of the world unite, but they're not united. So obviously that language wasn't resonating with people, and I think let's not blame the language, which I find what seems to being implied here. It's a little strange. Let's just understand what happened. And I think, were there serious problems with it? Of course there were. No one's denying that. But let me back up to just make one point. The very first night of Occupy, the New York Police Department nearly ended it. They bought hundreds of officers. They stood on the steps. They said, we're going to shut it down and arrest everyone. The police commissioner, William Bratton, shows up in an SUV, rolls down his window, confers with a couple of the white shirt commanders for a few minutes, and then the window rolls up, he goes away, and the cops dissipate. Now, what probably went on is that the police decided, well, there had been a ruling because of Bloombergville, a proto-Occupy movement a few months earlier, that sleeping outside was protected public protest, First Amendment activity. Not that the NYPD cares about the law, it thinks it is the law. On top of that, Zuccotti was this public-private hybrid space where the police had to be invited in by the owners, Brookfield Properties. And so what the police were really figuring was they were making a tactical decision that, oh, this is just going to peter out like Bloombergville did, so we don't need to go in and do some illegal actions that might lose us some political capital. But I can assure you, to this day, they're kicking themselves for not having done that. And if they had evicted it the first night, none of this would have gone on. No one would even remember that it existed. So there's all these accidents that go and contingencies. So let's just understand how it developed in and of itself without trying to impose all this ideology onto it.
Gerald, I saw that you had unmuted earlier, and then we'll go to Ken and then Pam. I see that everyone wants to respond to this. So Gerald?
Yeah, basically, Brother Arun laid it out. I think that this is not to be looked upon. When you're involved in the heat of actual struggle, your slogan is not an analysis of reality. And so that's what Arun said. I don't want to add a whole lot to that, because I found that it was in America today, America, we still need slogans that touch the working class as it actually exists. And I think that the 99% slogan, I saw thousands of people chanting, "We are the 99%," and that was a small step forward. I agree with everyone.
Great. So Ken, would you like to add on to this about the discussion about the slogan 99% versus 1% versus the question was about the imprecise character of it was what was asked.
I'm going to go back to my first leaflet. I responded, I said, first of all, I said the ruling elite doesn't know what's happening. And then I said, almost as clueless are those doctrinaire radicals who remain on the sidelines, glumly predicting that the movement will be co-opted and complaining that it hasn't instantly adopted the most radical positions. They, of all people, should know that the dynamic of social movements is far more important than their ostensible ideological positions. Revolutions arise out of complex processes of social debate and interaction that happen to reach a critical mass and trigger a chain reaction, processes very much like what we are seeing at this moment. The 99% slogan may not be a very precise, quote, class analysis, unquote, but it's a close enough approximation for starters. An excellent meme to cut through a lot of traditional sociological jargon and make the point that the vast majority of people are subordinate to a system run by and for a tiny ruling elite. And it rightly puts the focus on the economic institutions rather than on the politicians who are merely their lackeys. The countless grievances may not constitute a coherent program, but taken as a whole, they already imply a fundamental transformation of the system. The nature of that transformation will become clearer as the struggle develops. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And Pam, would you like to respond to both the responses by the panelists as well as the question? I can read it again.
I got it. Yeah, I guess the last bit, Ken, of what you read, Ray, is helpful. Like things become clearer in retrospect. And we are standing now like far enough to think about it, because I don't know if this is what you mean, Aaron, but I don't know if I understand like it is what it is, meaning like it is what it is, and therefore we need to make sense of it like in retrospect. And however imprecise our understanding of it now is, we sure need to understand that it wasn't just a series of accidents, meaning of course there's many things that are contingent for OWS to have started, but now all we have is what happened with it. And it just seems like from many of our presentations, there is a recognition that there was this mass potential, that people were drawn to it from all sides of the political spectrum, and there could have been something that could have happened with that, and yet it didn't. Right. So that, I mean, that's the kind of starting point for the question. And instead, what happened is that those same slogans of the 99%, which of course is not a class analysis, right? 99%, like if anything, I think that it gave people the sense that together they might matter, which is like, okay, that's fine. And then the question is what you do with that like attraction, you know? So what we're talking about, I guess, in this panel is what happened with that. Like, where did it go? How is it that people organized that energy? Where did it dissipate into? Insofar as there was this kind of quote unquote horizontal leaderless movement that became the narrative of Occupy, I think that in retrospect, that was not the case, that there were many competing voices, that there were people that thought that it should have been a movement for credit unions, and others who saw it as an extension of Democratic Party discontent, and others still that saw it as the foot soldiers for unions. And so what of that? Like, what do we think about what happened? I guess, you know, it's not about proposing that it should have gone a particular direction or another, but certainly we find ourselves with, you know, a starting point on the left that I don't know how much it has benefited from the slogans of the 99%, given that it was used to re-elect Obama.
Arun, would you like to briefly respond before we go on to more questions? Just kind of a quick response.
I'm not sure what to do with it. It was used to re-elect Obama. Sure. I mean, I wrote extensively about what the 99%, 99% spring was at Van Jones and his Rebuild the Dream and Move On and SEIU, all co-opted, but it was basically out there in the milieu. And, one of the funny things that I saw at the Occupy National Gathering in August of 2012 was basically a group of anarchists almost like complaining that they owned the movement and no one else had a right to it. And my partner Michelle and I, like as we travel across the country, there were Occupy camps that went nearly for a full year, and we called it the seven anarchists in the corner, that they had chased everyone else away with the infighting. So what I'm saying is, it is what it is yes, obviously there was a clear, I think, kind of political context where it came out of. There was some coherent politics, but whatever failures we want to ascribe to it are the failures of the left more generally. That is, we inherited for decades that there is no more socialist organized left anymore, that there are no mass parties that could have taken this energy into a more militant focused direction to make broader change. I mean, that's what these moments allow you to do, is to build movements, but there was no one there to really build it. And so it did lead to, I think, some new things, like, energy in terms of the climate justice movement gave a left edge to Black Lives Matter, the Bernie campaign, et cetera, et cetera. But this is more about the historic failures of the left than of Occupy in particular.
So I wanted to ask a question that I'm going to add on one of the questions from the crowd too, because they're kind of similar. Because it's about the discussion of the 99% versus 1%. This kind of language came up in the 2016 election. So Bernie Sanders used to talk about the billionaire class. But likewise, Donald Trump during the primaries said, aren't the bankers killers, he called them, right? It was at one of the first Republican primaries. And Donald Trump himself, along with Bernie Sanders, both supported Occupy. And Donald Trump also supported the Tea Party, meaning he thought they were kind of dual phenomena of discontents with finance, with the recession, things like that. So I was wondering, and I'm going to add a question from the audience onto mine. The speakers mostly told us about what they thought 10 years ago, some reading from texts they wrote at the time. Have the 10 years that have since elapsed, marked by Trumpism and the rise and fall of the socialist turn, have these 10 years not provoked any need to reevaluate those events? Meaning this slogan has definitely been more than willingly accommodated by, we can say, the ruling class. It didn't seem to necessarily challenge them in any ways. And Occupy, as Pam had mentioned, definitely a lot of them voted for Obama the next year. Maybe a few of them voted for Ron Paul. I don't know exactly. But, you know, in terms of that question, I'm going to put it in the comment section as well. So if anyone would like to respond to that about kind of Trump and Sanders. Yeah, Gerald, go ahead. Unmute.
You know, I'm trying to be civil here, but actually what, you know, this question you just raised up has just been a battle for me. I don't understand America to a certain degree, because that what you just said was shown in reality when there are people, like 10% of the people that voted for Trump voted for Bernie Sanders first. And when he lost in the primary, then they voted for Trump. I don't understand no shit like that. Okay, I'm gonna be honest with you. I don't understand these crazy ass folks running around talking about they're against vaccines. I'm sorry. I'm totally shut off from that. I cannot understand it. It is a mental illness, it's a mass psychosis. I don't really, because now the fascists have jumped on that shit, see, and they're using this as focal points to organize to build their organization, the anti-vax stuff. Well, for a long time, Trump, you know, and it's so devoid of common sense. It's so devoid of anything remotely. It's not about Marxism. It's about just common, you know, 1 and 1 is equal to 2, and just rationality. This movement that we're seeing in America, and it's growing, unfortunately. And by the way, Black people are joining this movement. More Black people are supporting Trump. I've seen so many Black anti-vaxxers, is blowing my mind. And I kind of just turn away from it and try to go. But this is a problem. And we better find a solution for this, because you're going to turn around and next thing you know, the fascists are going to be a real force in America. So I'm afraid I don't have an answer, but I can see the problem.
Okay. Arun, would you like to respond? I know you brought up the Tea Party as well and how Occupy had changed the narrative during one of your responses. So the question of how Trumpism has affected maybe our view of Occupy or changed it. Yeah.
So, I mean, this is okay. This is tricky. I mean, I've covered all these movements. I covered the Tea Party movement, actually going to meetings and talking with members. I think the Tea Party movement, it was very clear to me at the time as that it was an explicitly white supremacist movement, and so it was just a small step from the white supremacism to white nationalism of Donald Trump, because they suddenly became opposed to social spending, you know, under the guise of like, oh, this is all about the budget deficit and the national debt when they didn't give a crap about it during these massive deficits during the Bush years. But once a black guy is in office, this is the most important thing. And one of the things I discovered through my research is you could find a pretty good correlation between levels of Tea Party support and the percentage of brown and black students in public schools, state by state. And, you know, the Tea Party was very much appealing to older white men who had above middle class income. They weren't by any means wealthy, but they had above average income and wealth, and who basically wanted to defund social services. And in Occupy, there were some like reactionary tendencies. We met very, very few actual people who claimed they were in the Tea Party, but there was very much a libertarian impulse. It was not uncommon to see a Ron Paul tent at various Occupies. There was this fetishization of "It's a Wonderful Life" style capitalism. You know, in terms of like, you know, small business owners, everybody knows each other and takes care of each other. And frankly, also an ideology of whiteness that was present in many, I think, in a lot of Occupy places. But one of the things that happened during Occupy is you started to have, I think, some of these hard and fruitful discussions about race and about the connections between racial justice and economic justice. But I think there are people who want to see that somehow like Occupy played a role in Trumpism. I don't really think it did. I mean, the thing is, Trump was very good at basically attacking from the left and right at the same time. But his project ultimately is this kind of fascistic project, white nationalist project, and he supports the ruling class accumulation, and much of the ruling class supports him outright. Or at least covertly, because they recognize that they're going to get a huge amount of wealth transfer. So yeah, maybe he's attacking the banks, whether that's, you know, out of his anti-Semitism or populism, but he's not fundamentally opposed to the rule of the banks.
Pam, go ahead, and then we're going to go to the questions.
You know, I guess it strikes me now how things have flipped. Like there's this 99%, the people, the rhetoric and all that stuff. And now, in fact, like post Bernie's loss and even post like 2016, it's like not the people, but there are these like deplorable fascists, white supremacists who are not part of the people, and they just exist outside of the category of the people. And then there's the true people who somehow, I don't know, by they voting Democratic support like the brown people. So it strikes me actually that there was like a very quick shift between like the 99% were all the people to a rather divided America. I guess like, I don't think that what's being said here is that Occupy advanced some kind of Trumpist agenda, but that rather that Occupy expressed a shift in the constituencies and the sort of alliances that were already in the American public that could have been the grounds on which to build a radical leftist movement, or whether it be like a mass socialist party. Who knows, right? Like that could have been a question, but instead these energies were redirected into the same like party leadership. So I don't know, I feel a bit, Gerald, I feel a bit of, I'm stressed by the idea that what's going to happen, what continues to happen, is that the narrative of the fascists are coming, like, will be the only thing that the left holds on to. But that is used as a justification for just voting Democrats into power. And so, like, is it the case that we're in a situation in which like fascist America is around the corner? Or, you know, I don't buy that narrative, like personally speaking. Like I personally know a lot of like people that look like me that voted for Trump, and I don't really think that the support for that president has to do with an extension of white supremacy. And I think that we do a disservice to try to understand that phenomena when we present the narrative in this way. And we just are not really speaking to people's issues and concerns, right? In the same way that you talked about this kind of decolonized Oakland movement, they were just like so disconnected from the actual concerns of people. In the same way, I think that when we talk about Trump as an extension of white supremacy, it's like the people that voted for him are like, what are you talking about? So I don't know, like that just makes us lose touch with reality.
Gerald, did you want to say just very quickly a minute, because I wanted to add some other questions on from that crowd. So
This is not any hostility to Pam, but Pam, you may not know, I am an opponent of the Democratic Party. And in fact, what you're seeing, and what strengthens fascism, by the way, is Biden's activity. He promised the moon. They done knocked his monkey ass down to the ground. I mean, there's nothing that he's really delivering, the so-called deliverables. There's nothing. He is in trouble. And I want to tell you, so when you see him in trouble and you see the Republicans are actually holding out, they're stopping him from delivering anything that might look good to the working class. And then, so what is the so-called left? We talking about the goddamn DSA. They running around kissing the Democrats' ass. It's a problem. We got a problem here. I didn't want to address that problem because we were talking about Occupy and some of the stuff, you know, and maybe I'm just not that good. But the point okay, bro. The point I'm trying to make is that this, I see these fascist groups getting the cooperation of the ruling class and the police. And whether you like it or not, when they start showing up at anti-vax stuff, this is not good. Finish.
So the next two questions actually are related, so we'll be able to add further comments to that. One of them is related to last summer. So the leaderless uprising that led to the burning of the police station in Minneapolis, did it borrow from Occupy or leverage any of the space created by Occupy in some ways? From anarchists? Would it have benefited from a more serious Marxist or more 9-hour meetings? So that's one question. I'm going to add another one onto that of a very similar kind. And this is directed towards Ken. Ken read from an essay written during Occupy that its leaderless character made it more difficult to arrest and therefore shut down the movement. On the other hand, he pointed out that most occupiers were political newbies. Did the lack of leadership arise from tactical or ideological reasons or due to a lack of experience? So these two questions that I'm putting into the comment section are about kind of what are the consequences of this kind of leadership-less kind of organization, movement, spontaneity, especially last summer, that was, you know, a lot of new people were involved in various kinds of protests or what you would call it. So Ken, if you would like to respond to those questions, I put them in the answered section.
Let's see. When I say the thing that I'm being quoted for, that the fact that a lot of people were newbies, so to speak, or new to politics, let's say, it's not to say that they were ignorant, but that they didn't have the experience of being in political groups and all the manipulations and debates that implies. I was just stating a fact. I was not saying that this is totally a good thing, that newbies are always going to do the right thing. But I'm saying that as we all know, if you actually looked at the number of politically committed, sophisticated people in the US or anywhere else for that matter, it's less than 1%. really. And then you have maybe 5 or 10% that who sort of read the newspapers or something and have a sort of vague general idea of what's going on. And probably 90% of the people, by any objective standard, would have to be considered newbies. I mean, they aren't really following what's going on. So the thing is, the fact that all those kinds of people show up at Occupy is a remarkable thing. They're not showing up at a thing against apartheid in South Africa 40 years ago, or against, I mean, all sorts of other movements. They mostly aren't showing up. They weren't showing up against things against the Vietnam War. They weren't, all that. So what's interesting is that it's indicative that something struck a chord with people that most other political activities didn't. So that alone is enough. You can go into all the subsequent things and say, oh, this led to this, and these people didn't know what they were doing. They allowed themselves to be fooled by Trump after they voted for Bernie or this or that, and say, oh, that's these people need some leadership or something. The point, I don't think that's the point. It's obvious that that's going to happen with new people, but that's how they learn. They're never going to learn if they're just reading some publication by some little leftist group or something and decide, oh, this is this. They're going to learn by being thrown into a practical situation and suffering the consequences of any poor decisions they make. And so you can just totally predict that something like Occupy is going to be very chaotic. It's probably going to have all kinds of problems, but it's the terrain on which problems like that can be solved. And in my view, it's the only terrain where they will be solved. The terrain of voting for different people into office isn't that terrain. It may accomplish something, but that's not how people learn how to run their own lives. So I think that something like Occupy, just like May 68, you had these people occupying the factories. They didn't know what the fuck they were doing, which is why a month later it went away. But the amazing thing is that they did do that, and they may have been working for 50 years and they never did it. Suddenly they did it. That meant that things rapidly moved. Like after an experience like that, you may continue to make mistakes, but that's where, if the world is ever going to change, it's going to go through things like general assemblies with the whole population of newbies.
I think the question definitely allowed for an opportunity of learning, but I think it was also asking about the George Floyd protests last year. And I think we can also talk about various protests during the 2010s, Black Lives Matter, and also various immigrant rights movements would also do occupations as well. How do you see them either like learning from Occupy? What do you see the connection there? Because I think what the question was asking is it possible that, the burning of the police station last summer, was that learning from Occupy? Was that related to the kind of tactics that they thought?
Well,
they had learned from it? Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
Okay, first of all, that wasn't learning from no damn Occupy. Let me tell you, that's deep, deep, deep down inside. Everybody that, okay, not everybody, but most people that saw what unfolded. Remember, we're talking about a city where they handcuffed people and then shot them. And it was well known where the police were openly working with fascist organizations when the NAACP and Black Lives Matter held an occupation in front of the police station. The police actively worked with fascist organizations that shot the Black youth. This was all publicly known. So to burn down the police station is that's not necessarily going back to, you know, our Occupy, that is Occupy Wall Street, but that was an Occupy. Yes, we all influence each other. Okay, so in a sense, Occupy Wall Street, you know, Occupy Oakland, Occupy the NAACP, Black Lives Matter, Occupy in front of the police station, all is related, you know, in some sense. But I'm gonna tell you something, that burning down the police station, that goes back, way back and way deep. People were celebrating around the burning of the police station. They weren't, just wasn't like throwing a bomb and running. They were celebrating and dancing around the police station while it was burning down. So that's a little bit deeper, I think, than the Occupy movement. Finish.
We're going to go to Pam, and then I saw also Arun, you had unmuted earlier, so I want to get everybody's responses to this.
I mean, yeah, it goes deeper, right? Because as you said, all of the problems of the left that were present in Occupy, those go deeper as well, right? So like what happened in Occupy was a result of like many decades of working through, maybe not very successfully, the problem of the power of the state, the police of which is the executive power of the state that still stands, right? No matter how many stations burn. And that's, I guess, like the question of like, what is the end goal? What is the relationship to the means and ends, which maybe was part of the problem in Occupy. That question wasn't maybe raised clear enough. So we have to raise it in retrospect. Like, how is it that you want to defeat the police? Because it's certainly still standing, despite it burning down and people celebrating afterwards. It was just a kind of like symbolic victory, right? People were like, yes, like we all agree, this is the problem. And yet there are so many different responses to police brutality because social discontent is mass social discontent. So like when Ken said like so many people showed out, like yes, because mass social discontent, but isn't the role of the left to give shape and to kind of provide some kind of coherence and consciousness to what otherwise would just be dissipated and returned and reabsorbed into already existing order, where people are just like, well, you know, maybe body cams or something, or, you know, maybe if you put some black faces in the city councils, or, you know, like social discontent is potential. I agree with Ken, like it's raw potential. But then the question is, what do we do with that? And what are the tools that we have, right? Like Aaron's pointing to a problem that is of the left. I agree 100%. The absence of a mass socialist party, which I would put it that way, means that the social discontent is going to be directed by the people who can lead, who are ready to lead already. And the left is not ready to lead.
Arun, go ahead.
Yeah, so first of all, Occupy is one of the few times where the left has encountered huge swaths of the public that was somewhat receptive to their ideas. And there are a number of things going on. Wilhelm Reich in The Mass Psychology of Fascism talks about bringing in the new. That's what the Nazis did. And the thing is, that's what any successful organizing does. It brings in the new. We saw it with the global justice movement that came out of Seattle, the anti-Iraq war movement, the Day Without an Immigrant, the Tea Party, Obama, Trump, Occupy did that. And the thing is, I think you had a lot of leftists who, I mean, it was not, I shouldn't say I think, I know, because I saw it again and again and again, lots of leftists who didn't like the fact that they had to deal with like quote unquote average Americans and just a lot of their grab bag of incoherent ideas and ideologies. You know, when we talk about what happened in Minneapolis, it's just like, sure, you know, it's just like, yes, of course it would have benefited from much greater social organization. But at the same time, there's a dialectic between the two, because I spent a few days in Chicago, and that was one of the few major cities that never got an Occupy encampment off the ground. And what I really saw going on the streets there was that was the problem of too much organization, that you had so many organizers that they were actually suppressing kind of that libidinal, spontaneous energy where things just kind of break loose. And so you can be too orchestrated. And we have to also understand, like when we're looking at the last 20 odd years of protests, we have these seemingly spontaneous moments. And, I agree with Frances Fox Piven with her assertion. Anyone who say these are like coming out of nowhere or spontaneous don't understand the history of what's going on. But I think we can call them spontaneous, whether that's Seattle in 1999 or February 15, 2003, or Occupy Wall Street or Ferguson or the George Floyd protests, that these moments are crystallizing all this anger and giving it a focal point and meaning. But the thing is, it kind of just moves like one step at a time, right? You have organization, you have this popular outburst, then you should be able to build new organization from it, that then the next time you have a popular outburst, it helps you to deepen and broaden the organization and ideologies. And I'm speaking more generally, sure, mass socialist parties, but it has to be more than that also, because one of the realities of the last a decade in terms of the organizing against police violence, against systemic police racism, police brutality, on mass incarceration and all that, is we don't really see a real leadership from the Black Lives Matter movement in any cities. Like, I've been talking to activists, I'm just like, is there one city where kind of the Black Lives Matter movement has real like hegemony over the movement against policing, police brutality, and folks who are in the know are like, no, not really. So there are deeper problems of coherent organization that we're still not. I think to a degree we're dancing around. So I'll just leave it at that for now.
I'm going to bring in two questions in the spirit of, you just brought up the Wilhelm Reich, the mass psychology of fascism. So one question. And this is also about organization and kind of breaking through the kind of Democrat-Republican kind of stranglehold on ideology. I've got a question for Arun and Ken. Something that I thought was interesting about Pam's presentation was the connection that she identified between Occupy and the Tea Party movement. My question is this: is there a way that the core demands or non-demands of Occupy could be seen as conservative? Is there a way in which the core demands of the Tea Partiers could be seen as progressive? So that's one question. And a related one, and this is related again to the conservative progressive side, is it not the responsibility of the left to take on apparently reactionary tendencies in the working class through socialist organizing, rather than running away from them and branding them fascists and white supremacists? So both these questions are about what's seen as the conservative and progressive tendencies, maybe the progressive side of the Tea Party, to kind of paraphrase a Wilhelm Reich term, and then the conservative side of Occupy, as well as the question of organization, such that, as we were talking earlier, these discontents are not funneled into conservative means like the Democrat and Republican parties. And the questions are in the answered section now. So Ken or Arun, I mean, one of the questions was addressed to you.
Let's see. What was the first question?
Yes, the first question is, I've got a question for Arun and Ken. Something that I thought was interesting about Pam's presentation was the connection that she identified between Occupy and the Tea Party movement. My question is this: is there a way that the core demands or non-demands of Occupy could be seen as conservative? Is there a way in which the core demands of the Tea Partiers could be seen as progressive?
Yeah, I'm not, when you say core demands, that could be taken different ways. For example, I can't say that I know, Tea Party people in person very much, but my impression is that while the substance of a lot of the things that they might explicitly demand is not very bright, it seems delirious often. There obviously is a core gut thing that the reason they're all hepped up about some things is that they've lost their job or I mean, it could be even racist kind of things. I mean, you can look at where that comes about. Why would a white person be, leaning racist? And it's because they've grown up in a world where they sort of thought that things were a certain way, and then suddenly there's more Black people taking the work or blah, blah, blah. And so they're upset, but they wouldn't be upset if they weren't also upset for legitimate reasons. Otherwise, who would want to bother? That's not a very interesting thing, just to say I'm white and you're Black. They do it because they're primed to do it, because they're frustrated in various ways. They may not have insurance, they lost their job, they feel inferior, the old, stereotypes aren't working anymore. And so they're going to express those maybe in ways that says, keep out the immigrants or do this. But there are legitimate reasons why they feel upset. And so the question is not to say, to put a different thing on their racism or whatever, but just to understand that the reasons that they're upset are understandable. And we have seen historically times where that type of person will potentially change into something extremely different. So that and you would say, oh, how can this coexist in the same person? But it's that the frustrations were legitimate and were accurately felt. It's just that they then concluded, because of media or various other things, that the problem was that some radical bad people were doing stuff and you had to suppress them. So I don't want to make an easy thing like to say you could take the Tea Partiers and do something different, but the Tea Party is probably a more promising thing than a sort of mainstream Republican or something. The Tea Party type of person could flip around. They're upset. Whereas the other person seems to be pretty complacent and they aren't going to flip around. They just want to protect their thing. That's enough for me.
Arun, did you want to respond? I saw you unmuted.
Yeah. I really got to take. I completely disagree with what Ken just said. Look, I've actually covered the Tea Party movement. I covered Trump across the country in 2016. I've covered the alt-right. I was at the Bundy occupation. I've covered the Patriot Prayer, Proud Boys, interviewed hundreds and hundreds of these people. When it comes to the Tea Party movement, this is, whether Ken means to or not, he's falling into the economic anxiety argument. Then this has nothing to do with Tea Partiers. They're not losing their jobs. They're not losing their health care. I've been to Tea Party meetings. These are a lot of retirees, a lot of people who are economically secure. They are all homeowners what it is this type, it's producerism, right? And so we have to go back to Andrew Jackson, which was this fundamentally viciously racist economic movement, and we see that with the Tea Party. Let's look at the name itself: Tea Party, Boston Tea Party. They idealize the founding fathers. They idealize these slaveholders. Okay, there is not anything to find in common with the Tea Party. These are not people you're going to flip around. Now, Occupy Wall Street, as I mentioned, I did talk about there are these conservative tendencies. It was in many ways a grab bag, this libertarianism, this idealization of It's a Wonderful Life America, the small business owners, the Move Your Money, which there were left-wing economists like Doug Henwood talking about, credit unions are not necessarily any better. They were also implicated in the subprime mortgage crisis. And more broadly, I think this notion that, yes, an organized left should, and a socialist left, of course, they should be challenging reactionary politics in the working class. But I think it's a grave mistake to run after these viciously racist elements of the working class. Frankly, what you see with a lot of the Proud Boy Patriot prayer, 3%ers, oath keepers, all these types are these people want to be right-wing death squads in the making. They even wear t-shirts that say that. They're violently misogynistic, violently racist, violently transphobic, and frankly, the world would be a better place if they all had a bullet in their head. These are the last people you should be trying to appeal to or organize. That doesn't mean that there aren't plenty of sections of the white working class who you shouldn't be trying to organize, but trying to run after these fascists is completely absurd and self-destructive.
Just to ask a question very quickly, Ken seemed to also put the racism as potentially an effect of things. So not just the cause that they are racist and therefore proceed, but that in a sense, it's kind of what they reach for, maybe out of a misunderstanding of their own discontents in that sense. I mean, that would be the other way around and not just that.
Let me talk about what, why I saw with the Trump voters. There is, yes, there's a social anxiety, but what it is, and it's been crystallized in Tucker Carlson and, the white nationalist power hour, the great replacement theory, that this idea that they're being replaced, and where we see this kind of fascistic social anxiety are in these communities that are heavily white, where there has been some increase in people of color, whether particularly Latinos, and suddenly, it's counties which have gone from 96% white to 92% white. So to them, it seems like, oh my God, it's this dramatic increase, even though it's a minuscule increase. So there are these social anxieties, and they may be wrapped up with economic issues. What I was arguing in 2016 was what Trump did very successfully was racialize class politics, right? That he turned immigrants into, especially Mexicans and Muslims, into the reason, the enemy for large parts of white America. But it's by no means just the working class, because we should also remember in 2016 in particular, he was getting tons of support among white Americans who made over $100,000 a year. So I think you have to actually dig down into the data and also be in these conversations and crowds and talking to these people to see what is actually going on. Because I think if you're doing it for afar, it leads to a lot of misconceptions as to what is actually going on there.
Can I get Pam first and then Ken, because I saw that Pam had unmuted earlier, and then Ken, and then also Gerald, if you wanted to say something, then we'll get closing remarks. So just to keep the goal in mind.
Excuse me, I just wanted to say this. and that is we done opened up a real essential discussion, and that is the question of the rise of fascism in the United States. I actually think that everyone in the panel made useful comments. That's right, contradictory but useful. But nonetheless, I have to leave now, and I want people to know I'm not leaving out of some pique, or it's just that I have to go speak at a Julian Assange defense rally, and that is the reason, because actually I think this discussion is rich and important, and I'm hoping we figure out some way to. I'm sorry, I thought it was only going to be an hour and a half, and it's almost 2 hours.
No problem. Thank you very much, Gerald. We appreciated your participation. Thank you. Yes, Pam.
I mean, I don't know. I guess like I have one maybe common sense response, which is I guess we're not the 99%. I mean, it just, again, it seems like we're undermining the whole kind of spirit of Occupy by making it seem as if those people who were tired of the Democratic Party and who may have voted for Trump are somehow part of some kind of white supremacist conspiracy. Meaning, I don't doubt that there are elements, as there are in a lot of places, kind of right-wing nut jobs, but doesn't really help us understand how is it that, racism is the ideology that divides the working class. So if the socialists' response is just to say that we need to get rid of the racists, it doesn't really help us. So I feel a bit frustrated by this narrative, which hasn't really changed since 2016 and doesn't really help us when we're trying to think about organizing the working class as the working class. I just feel there is a resistance to following through with the necessity for a mass party, whatever you want to call it. Like an actual party would need to organize people on the basis that they are experiencing the same problems, such as unemployment, and that all sorts of reactionary ideologies come out of that experience, right? That is part of what the left is supposed to do, educate people on true causes of their problems. And so it just seems like there's a fear to follow through on what that actually means, what it would mean to deal with people at the level where they're at to organize. I mean, I'm not saying that I have any solutions for that, but it seems that to just label people that voted for Trump or that stand behind a popular movement as somehow being prepped to become right-wing death squads. I don't know. I don't think that helps us, and we fall below the threshold of a kind of liberal conception of the people. Like it's no longer. We're not even talking about the left now.
Can we just get Ken's response quickly? Arun, I saw that you had unmuted, and we'll just get very briefly, and then I want to get the final remarks.
Yeah, I want to say more, but I'm like that's just not what I said, Pam. So, but please go on, Ken.
Ken?
I'll be very brief. I just want to say I am not in favor of so-called chasing after Tea Party people or something. I was just responding to a question from somebody who said there are Tea Party tendencies, that are very, just like there were Occupy tendencies that, and whoever was asking the question was just sort of saying, well, did you see some possibilities? So I'm saying, well, yes, among these masses of people, there are probably some people who are, some of the people are like what Arun said. I'm not debating that, but I'm just saying there's a lot of these people who are just sort of ignorant and they're talking without thinking. And if they might come around. I don't advocate going to them. I'm just saying that they, like Pam said, they are part of masses of people who are in confused circumstances. And so you just have to bear that in mind. It has nothing to do with justifying what they're saying. It's just understanding that a lot of people out there are confused. Enough that.
Right, they're part of the 99%. So just to get closing remarks now from everybody, there were kind of three questions, just because of time we couldn't quite answer, but it sort of summarized them. One of the questions was about how the Paris Commune pointed towards the necessity of a party. So it's a question about how does Occupy, in a sense, point towards the necessity of a party? I put them in the answered section. There was another question about the climate change movements. I think this came up in the presentations and about kind of the internet. So this is all about kind of organizing in the latter part. And then there was a question about the 20th century and Occupy's relationship to the 20th century. So there's a question about 1968. Did Occupy learn from that? And I think both Ken and Arun, in your responses, you said something, and I'm sort of paraphrasing, so please correct me, that Occupy had seemed to overcome something in the 20th century, or Ken, you said it was the happiest weeks of your life, if I remember correctly. And I think Arun, you said it was something that we had not seen in the US in the 20th century. I think that's what I heard. So maybe in your closing remarks, you could kind of address those questions. So let's start with Arun.
Well, I would just get back to it is a question of organization and strategy, but I think the kind of fluidity of social identity, of media, of the hyper speed nature of politics means you need to be in a relationship with these kind of more organic eruptions. That it's not. I think often when I hear like mass socialist parties, it strikes me as Fordist, and we are like kind of like in a post Fordist world. I say it's like it's no longer even postmodernist. I think we've entered a post reality existence. But I do think I do want to get back to the issue of who is being organized. I was very specific when I was talking about the fascists, right? Specific groups, Proud Boys, Patriot Prayers, the Bundys. The Bundys are scary, and they have this whole project that they are organizing out in the West, and in terms of like takeovers at the electoral level. And they are extreme violent reactionaries. So there are people who are seriously dangerous, and I also did clearly say there are plenty of elements of the working class that can be engaged with, even who have reactionary ideologies. But I think I didn't get into it because I didn't want to talk too long. But I'm talking about where do you engage them? It's through unions, right? Unions have this problem with some of them have a high percentage of their membership voting for Trump, but it is the one place where you can potentially engage them and start to shift them to the left, and where you are encountering truly a representative cross section of the working class. So I think if we are to think about what is to come next, yes, organization, leadership, discipline, but in relation with this kind of more libidinal politics, where one's and this more free-form politics, where one builds on the other, and do not seek to suppress these outbursts, but use them to pour energy into good organizing.
Great, thank you very much. Ken, closing remarks?
Yeah, as you may already know, I am not in favor of a mass party. I think that's this is too long to go into that, but just the other panelists seem to take that for granted, and I do not. And I'm also not an anarchist, but I feel that the party type of organization has demonstrated in various forms that it almost invariably bureaucratizes itself, usually far before it gets into power, let alone once it's in power. And that I would agree with Arun's emphasis on the importance of these spontaneous movements. It doesn't mean that you just sit there and let them happen, but that they are the whole engine of this thing. Without those, nothing is going to happen. I mean, that's the same thing Rosa Luxemburg says. The mistakes of a really mass movement are more important than the correct policies of the most brilliant political party. And so I don't have a solution like, instead of a party, do this. I just say that people who might think, oh, let's form a party and then we can have a bunch of people and get things done. Those things, actually, the Paris Commune did not demonstrate the need for such a party. The whole point that Marx said was that it showed an alternative form of self-social organization that people had not thought of before. And the workers' councils, the Soviets in 1905, pushed further in that same direction. And having nothing to do with Lenin, this is instead of parties, I would advocate that self-organization, which doesn't mean that individuals cannot argue within that and say, I suggest that we do this or that, but not that I suggest that some political party do what? Take over the government? The whole point of the commune and the original Soviets was that this was a form where the general population could self-manage their own liberation. And there is kind of a dialectical thing there with other people coming in from outside with different ideas. But I think the ultimate thing is that's what I would aim at. And that's why things like May 68 or the Occupy are significant for me, as not the solution, but as examples of the kind of thing that I would like to foster, whether through political or other things like that. So I'll let it go at there.
Thank you very much, Ken. Thank you. And Pam, your final remarks?
I guess if we think about it the most generously, OWS was a chance to have a conversation at a massive scale across nations in different parts of the world, across different political commitments, and the goal of which was to understand how to transform society to better the life of the majority of human beings. So take it most generously, that is what it was, right? So it was an opportunity to speak to one another about what are the major obstacles that stand in the way of that transformation. And I guess, like, looking back now, I have to say that we've spent a lot of time talking about these sort of like fascist right-wing groups, et cetera. And I just have to say, speaking as maybe a private, like, civil society member, I do not think that those groups were the obstacle to the success of Occupy. I don't think that those marginal right-wing elements were the ones that were responsible for the defeat of that potential for the transformation of society. And so, you know, one thing about the party, which I understand the concern, Ken, and I get why maybe even a lot of people are like, well, what is this party thing? Just to clarify, since Platypus has a reading group, which I encourage everyone to join, and we read the Second International Radicals, we read Lenin, Luxemburg, Trotsky. I think that primarily with the party and the International, right, which was a larger organization of socialist parties, what it allowed socialists to do is to learn from the mistakes of the past, to learn from its victories, and to clarify the tasks for the future. And that intergenerational conversation, which is not just about the immediate people around, sitting around in a room, but about how history speaks to us and what kind of goals we want to carve out for ourselves as socialists. That's what's missing. So that's what I mean by the party. I don't mean some kind of imposed bureaucratic leadership on social discontent that's spontaneous. I mean that kind of self-reflection, clarification, and sustained and ongoing dialogue across different parts of the world on what the tasks that are facing socialists, or the defeat of capitalism, right? Like, if you don't identify as socialist, fine. Like, the defeat of capitalism, like what would it actually mean? So I just think that we've lost the capacity to learn from Occupy because we don't have those things. So instead, we have ended up spending a lot of energy talking about these marginal right-wing elements, which I just don't think are the true obstacle today for working class organization and for socialism. So I would just encourage everyone to attend the Platypus Reading Group, to learn more about the Second International, to learn about what Luxemburg meant, which she said that if we haven't lost our capacity to learn from the mistakes, then there's hope for the revolution.
So thank you, everybody, for their participation today. I know some people have to run. I just want to say you can find more of Platypus's activities at platypus1917.org, where you can, under pedagogy, you can also find our reading groups. We have a YouTube page as well as a podcast that Pam hosts with Sophia Freeman, Shit Platypus Says, which also discusses some of these panels. And I saw as well there were some questions that we couldn't answer. If you would like to submit something, I also put in the comment section that we have a Platypus review, and it's a perfect place to submit and carry the conversation forward as well. This video and the audio will be up on YouTube today as soon as we can. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Ken. Thank you, Pam. Thank you, Arun. Thank you, Gerald. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.